When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Gregg Kaloustian. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Gregg, and I'm oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm oldish.
Hi, I'm Leslie, and I'm oldish.
Welcome to this episode of our podcast, Oldish, Conversations on Aging in the 21st Century. Today, we welcome our good friend, Leslie Ross Degnan, to tell you a little bit about Leslie as we begin. She enjoyed years in the classroom, loving picture books with young children. Now, in her oldish years, she spends time writing children's poetry and picture books, as well as writing reviews of new picture books. You can find her reviews on Amazon, Goodreads, and Barnes & Noble sites. Leslie also enjoys reading adult literature. When she heard about our podcast, she asked us if we'd be interested in reviewing and discussing grown-up books with oldish characters. We said we were. This is our first book review and discussion with Leslie.
We're happy today to have this first episode of what we're hoping and looking forward to as a series of book reviews and looking specifically at books that have themes of oldishness. So for our inaugural podcast of a book review, we're going to be looking at The Remnant Population. So Leslie is going to start us off and share with us about the book, the author, and then we're going to, the three of us, have a little book club and talk about this book. So Leslie, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Janet, and thanks, Gregg. Thanks to both of you for having me on your program. As Janet said, I'm going to do a little review of the book called Remnant Population by Elizabeth Moon. It was published by Random House in 1996. And I always like to know a little bit about the author. She is an oldish woman now. Elizabeth Moon's probably about 78 years old. And when she published Remnant Population in 1996, she was about 51. And at 51, this book was nominated for the prestigious science fiction Hugo Award for Best Novel in 1997. Not Best Science Fiction Novel, but Best Novel. I think that's kind of interesting. So this story that I'm going to tell you about takes place sometime in the distant future. We meet Ophelia, our oldish protagonist, after she's been living on this colony. They call it Colony 3245 for 40 years. Her children were born here. Her husband was buried here. And this is the place she calls home. It's the place that she plans to end her days. When the story begins, she's living in a village with her son, Barto, and his wife, Rosario, and she's feeling a little bit marginalized and unappreciated by her son and daughter-in-law. Of course, they're happy to have her cook and clean and do the laundry and work in the garden, but they aren't real keen on her interfering in their lives. If that sounds familiar, we'll talk about it later. Her daughter-in-law often feels compelled to tell her what to do, and when she's in the garden with that hat on, she says to Ophelia, "It's not decent for an old woman to be in the garden with nothing on her head but thin graying hair." One day, the company that brought them to this planet, Bancor, announces a plan to relocate the colony to some new far-off planet. And that's when Ophelia decides she's going to stay behind on her own. So she packs supplies and she makes a plan to hide out for a few days in the forest. This is when the shuttles begin to arrive to transport the rest of the colony to another planet. So they all leave. She hides in the forest. And when she thinks the coast is clear, she comes out and just manages on her own. And for a few months, she lives pretty happily on her own. She just has everything she needs to survive. They've left everything behind, everything in the village and the control center and food, and she has a garden. But she's very happy to be away from the demands and the judgments of her family and the community. She's doing great. Her garden's flourishing. She's eating well. She's learning how to maintain the computers and other equipment in the control room. She even survives a storm on her own on this subtropical planet that they live on. She lives on. One day she's in the control room and she hears a human voice on the radio. She is not happy about this. She worries a little bit. She's pretty worried. And so she sees some images on the monitor and notices that there's a shuttle preparing to land. Some kind of reconnaissance ship is returning to the planet. And then she sees and hears the voices of some other strange being. And it looks like they're running away from the landing site, but she's not really sure what's going on. There's fire in the landing site and mayhem, and there are lots of sounds that indicate some kind of an attack on the shuttle, probably by these native beings that she sees in a blurry kind of image. It looks like some kind of battle, and there's injuries on both sides. Somehow, the shuttle manages to leave, and there she is, stunned, wondering what happened, and knowing now that she's not alone on this planet, that there is some other unusual, strange being. And this, I think, is when the story gets really interesting, as Ophelia, over time, slowly makes contacts with these aliens. This alien population, she discovers a new life and a new meaning to being an elder. And Remnant Population, I think it's a great read for the oldish. But even in the future, in this story, we see some ageism in play. And I think that this story also addresses a lot of the themes that face the elderly and the oldish. Themes of power and powerlessness, identity, trust, even intelligence. So let the discussion begin.
Thank you so much. That was a great review. And we wanted the listeners to know that if you haven't read the book, you might want to stop the podcast, go read the book, and then come back and hear our book club conversation. Or not, but here we go. We're going to jump in.
There was something that I've been thinking about quite a bit since I first read this book last fall, which has to do with early on in the book. Ophelia begins to hear in her mind a new voice, and her whole life she'd had this voice that was, in a sense, a public voice where people would speak to her and tell her what to do, and she would respond in the voice of the person who's being told what to do. But when she decides, just before she decides to stay behind, another voice pops up inside of her head that says, no, you don't have to live that way anymore. You don't have to be that person anymore. You can be the person that you are. If you don't want to wear a hat, don't wear a hat. The very first thing that she does, when she has decided to stay behind and she knows that everybody else is leaving, is she wants to begin to experience the freedom. And her this new free voice, I think, is the way she feels about it, is the voice of freedom in her head. So what I've been wondering about is that a common experience? And do people, when they get to be oldish and they're their vision and their minds turn to the next stages of their lives, do they become free in a way? Freedom from the I know, for example, that I began to feel free of the requirements of being successful. And so, and her ideas of freedom is somewhat different from that. But I want to ask you too about, is this second voice, is this new, it's not a second voice, but it's a new voice. And you can hear the new voice as the book goes along. You can hear the old voice fading in importance and the new voice getting louder inside of her. And I don't know, is this common?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point because I thought it was really fun in the book that she saw clothing as a you know, as a way to express herself, express her freedom. Like one of the first things that she did was go in and make this like big cape with all these colors and big eyeballs and patterns and geometric things on it to wear. And then she stopped wearing her shoes. She stopped wearing her hat. I think that was her an expression of freedom. I saw her change in clothing as that kind of expression of freedom. Sometimes she didn't wear anything at all. There was that one scene where she went down the middle of a village without any clothes on, and I thought, well, okay, that's real freedom.
Yes. Yeah, I definitely think we see in her an evolving towards the words that you used, Leslie, which I think are so capture ageism, about issues of power, identity, trust, intelligence. I feel like we saw her evolve during the course of this time. And, Gregg, regarding that question, I was thinking, in books, we get to see other ways things could be. So we got to see Ophelia at the very end of her time being around her culture, which had put her in a box of this is how we think of you, this is what we expect from you. Even when they were getting ready to go back on the ship go on the ship to another colony, they had told, or Ophelia was aware that they were aware, the people in charge, that people who were old probably wouldn't make it through the cryogenic process. And so I think she felt, Leslie used the word marginalized. I think that's probably, for me, the number one of the top keys words, is that she felt ultimately completely marginalized. Like they felt like she probably wouldn't even survive this trip, but she was expected to get on this ship and go and probably die. And nobody seemed to have much to say about that. There was no, her son and daughter-in-law weren't expressing sadness that they went, So I feel like this book is showing us what it would be like if we as oldish people can take that step of turning off those voices from our past about what it means to be oldish or old. And because I think it's about being old and then stepping into the thinking about what can I be as oldish, that there's so much left for me, and being able to be free to be empowered, to recognize that we still are intelligent even as we're aging. So I guess I feel like there's a lot of us as we get old and go through oldishness that don't make that leap, that don't have that space. Like she got that space to do that literally because everyone left. Every single person she knew left the planet. So she had this opportunity to either stay in her old way of thinking, and instead she was like, oh, wait a minute. I don't have to wear clothes. I don't have to wear my hat. I don't have to I can be who I am.
Yeah, I think there is a real sense of freedom. I think just in our time and place in this moment of as people age to decide that they're going to wear what they want to wear. They're going to more or less do what they want to do because they don't have to deal with their children. Their children are grown and gone, and their lives have changed. They don't have to deal with the day-to-day expectations of jobs and money and earning. And behaving in a certain way or looking a certain way. So she was really able to sort of throw off a lot of that, and I thought that was a great example of getting how people that are aging do that. I mean, just even me, I don't get up and get dressed to go to work anymore, which is nice. I mean, I can stay in my pajamas all day if I want to, but I wouldn't, usually do that. And I also think in the story, the way she's marginalized by her community and all those expectations are gone, and that the aliens have a different set of, when she finally meets them, have a different set of expectations that she finds more tolerable, that in fact is more tolerable. And I hesitate to really go into details here, because I don't want to have a spoiler. I don't want to create a spoiler. But I will say that it's really the opposite of the human counterpart, that as an elder, at some point, Ophelia plays a different role, a more important role in this new culture and community. So,
well, I'm thinking as you're talking that I suddenly feel like that when she moved into that part of the story where, what her role was with the aliens, it was almost like what the oldish people in other cultures or in other times were viewed in our world as wise, crone, that we revered. And so it's almost like she got a chance to have that experience. What do you think? Do you think that looked like that?
yeah, I think it very much looked like that. And I think that the alien culture was like another culture, like what you just said. Even though it's in the future and they're another kind of life form, she over time began to understand them and communicate with them and understand her place within their community, because they welcomed her. They welcomed her as an elder.
And they kind of revered her. It got to that point where as she learned the language and learned the customs and was respectful, they, looked to her for guidance around various aspects of child rearing and things like that.
Right. Yeah, she really had quite an important role, which again, I don't want to say what it was. I suppose you could read the book.
I think it's okay to go ahead and do that, Leslie, because I think, we've given fair warning. And, people who are still with us at this moment have either read the book or aren't going to read it anyway. So I don't think there's a huge need to restrain yourself from making your points. And, if somebody goes past this point, certainly, second warning, somebody goes past this point, certainly, and the book is spoiled for them, it's not our fault.
Well, I wanted to talk also a little bit about this trust and mistrust theme in the book, because I think that, when her family and herself, for example, Ophelia, when the aliens land, Ophelia sort of expects to be killed, as soon as she meets them. She mistrusts them until she gets to know them, and then she becomes, of course, a teacher. She teaches them the technology in the village. She teaches them, how to the language. She learns their language, and she also becomes somewhat of a healer when they're injured. She helps them. She has medicine, so she can heal them, and becomes, in that regard, a respected member of their community. Whereas, on the other hand, Ophelia mistakenly trusts the company originally, that was going to transport her and her family to this other planet, to arrange the transportation and pay for the transportation for everybody in the colony. But in fact, the company refuses to pay for her, saying that, like you said, Janet, her age, she probably won't survive the cryogenic sleep anyway. So why pay for a useless old lady, right? So she doesn't get that feeling that she's a useless old woman when she meets the other inhabitants of the planet. I never know what to call them, like aliens or, other inhabitants or original inhabitants of a
Yes,
certain
right.
indigenous people, indigenous creatures. I'm not really
Yes.
sure what to call them.
Yeah.
But that also happens in other parts of the book, and it also happens, I think, in an oldish capacity.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you can also draw any parallels to that.
Well, there's certainly a lot of political parallels that can be easily drawn for people who are interested in things other than just oldishness. Is the view of the patriarchy and the corporatocracy and the the almost vicious bumbling of the corporate bureaucracy that results in all of the things happening that are events, really large events. In the book, they didn't leave the the Bancorp didn't pull the colony because they wanted to. They pulled the colony because they screwed up and lost the contract to manage the colony. And the people coming in behind them weren't a heck of a lot better, or didn't look like they were going to be a heck of a lot better. And I think it might be an important point that Ophelia and her family, and from the sounds of it, the other colonists are people of color. And it seems like the agents of the corporation are not described that way. So I think there's some, there's a racist lens in here as well. Although it's interesting that far in the future, the people with Hispanic names and all the main human characters have Hispanic names, but there doesn't seem to be what I would think of as a Hispanic culture. The culture's swept away, but their appearance and I'm not sure that this is true now that I've said it, but their appearance, we know nothing about their language because the story is told in Ophelia's language, but in English, so we don't know whether she spoke English or is the book kind of a translation of her thoughts into English so that we could read it. But I think there's an important look at the current kind of political landscape through this view from the future, which is one of the things that science fiction is for, is how does what's going on now look in the future, and does that give us a different way of looking at what's going on now? So I think that part of it was fairly important.
Mm-hmm.
And then introducing the aliens, and I don't know what to call them either, but aliens works. At least it works for me. Partially because the term alien has been in science fiction forever, but it almost always ended up meaning monster.
Mm.
You think about the movie Alien and the Predator and all of those aliens were, the day the Earth stood still and all of that. They were almost always monsters. But these folks are not. They did attack the second colony as it landed, but for a reason that we found out later was, well, no kidding, they attacked them. It didn't have anything to do with, here comes these horrible alien invaders. It's how they came that caused the attack on them. And it was more a get off of where you are than it was, get out of here. We're going to kill you. It's more like, don't land there.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So, and that was a hugely important insight. As we go forward, is like a total lack of understanding of where you were going.
Mm-hmm.
That we saw in the Christopher Columbus thought he was in India. Just a total lack of understanding of where you actually are in that process results in all kinds of mess.
Well, yeah, it really does relate to on a political level, it relates to the attitude of people who colonize, those who colonize. There's a superiority to the colonizer versus the person who's on the planet that you're colonizing or in the country that you're colonizing. I think that happened too when the second shuttle came, when it was the shuttle of scientists that arrived, and Ophelia met them in a powerful way. But they really did marginalize her, and they thought that the aliens were not intelligent. I mean, they assumed that they were more intelligent than the aliens, and so they're coming here to gather scientific information, and they had this important goal, and they couldn't understand any of the aliens. But I think that was a big turning point, when the humans arrived on that second shuttle. I mean, she'd been especially for Ophelia too, because she'd been living among those aliens for many, many months. She knew their language, she knew their gestures, their music, she knew so much about them. She could communicate with them. But they still saw her as a stupid old woman, these expert human scientists saw her as a stupid old woman. And initially through their eyes. And it seems to me it wasn't until they were able to see her through the ones that remained on the planet were able to see her through the aliens' eyes and how much they cared about her and how important she was to them. And that the aliens themselves were very intelligent and quick to learn and, also, didn't really, I don't know how much the aliens really understood the attitude that the humans felt, but that the humans saw them as ignorant, and that they couldn't possibly understand this advanced technology, right? I don't think that was a part of their picture, but in reality, they caught on very quickly to all that advanced technology with the help and support of Ophelia. Because she had to figure it out, right? Because she was living there by herself, so she had to figure it all out. And in the end, I think some of the human scientists the ones that decided to stay behind, became equals, to the aliens, and continued to learn about them as I don't know, anthropologists,
Yes.
and study them and coexist with them. And of course, Ophelia was that link that made it all possible because she was, the first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then she accomplished all of that as an oldish woman.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering if the reason why this book captured aliens as intelligent, interesting, culture evolved, because it was written by a woman.
I think so.
Yeah,
I just wonder, that for Elizabeth Moon, that why not? Why do we assume that aliens are monsters? And so, I just wanted to ask about how, I guess what I'm feeling in this moment is, how do we as people who are oldish claim that space for ourselves? So there's a part of it that is, Ophelia, first of all, just made a very courageous decision to not go with everybody. So that was a first step, is that she moved into this place of more empowerment for herself. And then she had so much time by herself to kind of bring that into reality and evolve into herself as fully as crone and wise woman. But I'm thinking about us here and in our lives and how we're in a culture that doesn't necessarily respect aging, that there is ageism mixed in with racism and other ways of putting people down and minimizing them and not seeing them. And I'm even thinking about our families, not ours in particular, but I had a conversation with a dear friend last night who's past oldish. He's in his 90s, but he was talking to me about feeling marginalized in his own family and feeling like not seen. And and so it just, for me, it comes back to, how do we do this? This is a part of it. This is a big part, is talking together, both talking together, talking about books, reading books, having a podcast.
Well, yeah, that's a slippery slope, because I think that we have to ourselves see ourselves not marginalized, and the way to do that is to stay in the stream of life.
Yes.
Yeah, keep learning new things, keep having new experiences, just keep doing things and doing new things, and not saying, oh, I'm old, I can't do that. I'm too old to do that. I mean, there is some reason there, right? You have to be smart about it. You can't take dangerous risks like you could when you were in your 20s and 30s, but you have to, you have to be smart about it. But I have a friend too who, she's in her 80s, and she's bilingual in French, and she wanted to go back to France. But she was nervous and anxious about traveling on her own because she was an older woman, and running from one gate to the next in the airport to catch her flight. So she allowed her friends, some who were oldish, some who were not, to encourage her to say, yeah, well, you could do this, and you're going to go visit a friend, and it'll be okay, so that you can allay the fears of other people that are a little bit anxious about trying something new or doing something new. And I think, but in our story, I don't think Ophelia was at all anxious about doing something new. She couldn't wait to get rid of everybody so she could be on her own. Yeah, so I think that there's, I suppose maybe it's personality too. She had quite a personality, Ophelia.
Yes.
Yeah, she certainly did. I think it's important about Ophelia that she made her decision to stay before she found out that if she went along on the ship, she probably wouldn't survive. That was not in her mind when she decided to stay. Physically, anyway, she knew that the part of her that wasn't alive already in the colony that she lived in, with the family that she lived in, the part of her that wasn't alive, that she valued, had this other voice, she knew that when she was thinking that she was going to go to another colony, that it was just going to be the same old, and her true self would continue to not exist, or would, to not be alive in a full sense. And she decided to stay, to give that self life. It was made easier for her, I think, when it dawned on everybody that if she went on the spaceship with everybody else, she wasn't going to survive the trip anyway, and wouldn't know that she didn't survive the trip because they were going to be in stasis the whole time. So she made the decision, though, that for the important part of her life had to stay where she was. And she had to, even if it meant being alone, she had to do that. And I think that was a big key to her character in that. And then she just blossomed enormously. She was a gardener, which was an important part of her. The descriptors of her is her knowledge of the gardening and all of that. And when as soon as she decided to stay, she started to blossom. You mentioned the clothing thing. The very first thing that she did after she decided to stay was she took her clothes off, and then before she went back out with the people, she put on just her dress. So she left off her underwear. She freed her body first. That was the first thing that she brought to freedom. And by the time the scientists arrived, they didn't know that she was there. It was totally baffling to them. They thought everyone had left, and they had no idea that anybody, certainly not what they thought of as an old woman. And although just as an aside, the author was 51, but the character was 70 at the beginning of the book. So she was an oldish. They certainly did not expect to see an old woman there. And by the time they arrived, she forgot that it made a difference that she was naked. So she greeted them wearing just a cape and some ornamental jewelry and stuff that had symbolic meaning for her based on things she had learned from the aliens. But she had forgot. I don't think she forgot she was naked. She forgot that it made a difference. She was so thoroughly this true person that she forgot that the art, that the standard cultural requirements applied.
Oh, I loved that scene. When they land and there's this old human being greeting them in this crazy flowing cape with these wild-eyed patterns all over it. I mean, and I also love that they looked at her and they thought, oh my God, they labeled her as like inappropriately attired,
Yeah.
and likely disturbed.
Yes.
And yet they arrived in this subtropical planet, right? Completely covered in layers of clothing, seriously overdressed in all this protective clothing.
Yeah.
So in reality, they were the ones that were really inappropriately attired.
Yes. All of their conventions were incorrect in that environment.
Yeah. But then later, when they came to visit her at her house, I thought this was kind of interesting too. This whole thing around clothing and power and, expectations. When she invited them to come to her house for dinner, right? And she felt this pressure to dress in a normal way. She said, I have to put normal clothes on. And so she went back to putting all her layers on. And she was aware of their sensitivity around how an elderly person should dress. And then she again begins to feel that loss of freedom creeping back into her life and says, oh no, I don't want to go there again. And it was all around the clothing that she wore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good symbols.
Yeah.
The clothing, the covering up of the true self is good symbols.
I realized that when I was reading the book, one of my worries for her, which now I'm thinking is my own worry, which is probably obvious, was I kept all the time that she spent by herself before the aliens showed up. I kept thinking, how is she going to really survive? So like when that big storm came and I thought, and I just thought of things like, well, what if she gets hurt? What if she gets injured? What if, like really injured, like broke her leg or something? What if she gets sick in some way that's significant and there's no one there to take care of her or help her, or there's no medicine? And I do think that is a thread of thought for me around that I think is partly our culture. I mean, obviously we get older and parts don't work as well or don't, but it was a big part of my reading. I just kept thinking, because I didn't know what was going to happen. So I kept thinking, oh, here's a big storm. Is she going to be okay? What's going to happen? And what would she, then I'd go more into what would she do if something did happen? And so I think that's kind of interesting that I didn't trust that she was going to be okay.
Yeah. I think the author did though. So that was a good, because the author threw everything you can think of at this woman.
Mm-hmm.
The storms, wild animals, aliens, horrible humans, getting old, the terrible family. She threw everything you could think of at this woman, and this woman just kept walking right through it. And we talked earlier today about the questions that we ask of our guests on the podcast include, what excites you and what are you afraid of? And Ophelia didn't display a lot of fear. She was so accepting, which I think is the key to her, how she got along with the aliens, was she didn't freak out. Um, uh, but the author kept saying, shouldn't you be afraid of this? Shouldn't she be afraid of this? Shouldn't we all be afraid that this horrible thing is going to happen to her? And the answer turns out to be no. So stuff might happen, but we don't have to be afraid of it.
Yeah, right. She really does shed a light on the vulnerability of being oldish, but also the capacity, that everybody has to survive. It's sort of a survival thing. And she was a lot of the time, I think, in survival mode. Ophelia was, as a human being. And so that kind of surpasses your age. I think your ability is to survive is, I think I was trying to get to that earlier, is in the kind of person that you are, or what your personality is, or what you're capable of, or sometimes you don't even know what you're capable of until you find yourself in that kind of a situation. And I think that was a lot of what happened to Ophelia. And in a way, I think she invited it, because she opened the door to a new life by staying behind. Somehow she knew it was going to be different. I don't think she knew how different it was going to be, because she didn't know there was another life on that planet.
Absolutely.
She had never explored, their colony and their community had never explored the entire planet. So she wasn't aware of it, but hey, ignorance is bliss sometimes, right? Situation like that.
In terms of the genre and exploration of things, this was really rich, and the theme, the overall plot is not unusual in science fiction at all. There's a lot of science fiction is about, some guy crash lands on a planet somewhere, and it's the Robinson Crusoe story over and over again. And Robinson Crusoe meets the native guy and so on and so forth. But it's always a young, vigorous guy. And so to look at it and say, well, what if our protagonist is not a young, vigorous guy, but an oldish woman? How would it be different? And it's different in every important way that I could think of. The young guy would have, there would have been guns blazing the whole time, and and no exploration at all about many of the questions that we've been talking about. So that take on a typical theme in the genre is really super important. I've been reading the last couple of years, I've been reading a lot of science fiction written by women, and I've been reading I've read a lot of books in my life, and I've read almost all of the, I'd say, important, what are named as the important science fiction writers. So 75% of the books that I've read in my life are science fiction. I came across a list of the top 200 science fiction writers, and I got through 110, and I'd read all but 5 or 6 of them. And the 5 or 6 that I hadn't read were women. So I started reading women science fiction writers, and was very happy to have this one suggested to me. It's way different. It's way different. The books are more thoughtful. They're way less bang bang. They're obviously they're gonna be way less adolescent sexist. There's a lot of science fiction books are adolescent fantasies, and they're way less that. And there are some really brilliant women writing science fiction these days, and their take is, I haven't found one yet that's a bang bang, good old fashioned. I don't know about good old fashioned, but you know what I mean. The Space Invaders kind of science fiction. The women are just more thoughtful about it. They're more exploring, different questions. Like, I can't think of a single book written by a man that would have explored these questions the same way. There would have been conquering in there. It would have been told from the point of view of the conquerors or the scientists, not from the point of view of this oldish. It's really a crone. She's almost like, if you looked up crone in the dictionary, they should have her picture in there.
Oh yeah, she's definitely a crone and revered in the end by the aliens. But I think aside from it being written by a woman, I think for me the most interesting part is that the main character is an old woman.
Yeah.
And I think that it's I really enjoyed this story, and it was really interesting to explore this main character, because she was so rich, because she had lived a life and she was so experienced and had so much life before her, and her choices were much more conscious. They weren't.
Yes.
She just didn't suddenly find herself on this planet, or
Yes.
was born on it as a child. She made all these choices to be there and to go there and to be alone and to survive. So I think it's going to be very interesting to explore more literature with oldish protagonists.
And that's a great bridge to, we're coming to the end of our episode, and we definitely want to do this more. This has been awesome and a lot to think about. Is there one last comment that anyone has?
Yeah, I think if anyone who's listening to this, if you haven't read this book yet, go get it and read it. It's really rich. It's very colorful. It's the world building is really remarkable. She creates a whole world for these awakenings to take place in. And I think that one of our themes is awakening to life at a time when people historically were turning toward death, and oldishness is awakening to life at this point. And this character awakens to her life in a very real kind of a way, and it's so well written that you feel it. Certainly I felt it. It's just so well written that people should go out and get this book.
I agree. Yeah, so read it to find out what happens to Ophelia and how she is forever remembered and revered.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Leslie, so much for joining us. It's been wonderful.
My
and this
pleasure.
is the first of more is the goal. So
Great.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you very much. This has been great.
It is. I can't wait to read the next one.
yes. So let's talk about what the next one is. Do you want to say that? We're thinking of Travels with Charlie. So we're going from, when was this book written, by the way, Remnant Population?
This book was written in 1996.
Okay. So I don't know when Travels with Charlie was published, but we know it's a classic.
It was in the 1960s.
Okay. So that's our next book. And we'll be coming back to that at some point with Leslie. And thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That's it for now. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Leslie Ross Degnan for joining us. You can find Elizabeth Moon's Remnant Population on Amazon. It's very interesting. We'll post a link in the show notes that will take you right to it. If you buy it after you click on the link, we'll get a small affiliate commission, which you can think of as an easy way to support our podcast. You can also find it in your local library or online library, maybe. If you like what you heard, please tell a friend. If you haven't listened to our other conversations, now would be a good time. You can find them at www.oldish.me or wherever you listen to podcasts. Please rate and review them. You can also leave comments on this and other episodes at www.oldish.me. If you have suggestions for someone we should talk with, please post them in the comments on any episode. It will always be true that the most fun I ever had playing pickleball was just us hitting the ball back and forth and laughing on the little court next to the library with the river flowing by and the eagles wheeling overhead.